Hello and welcome to the On the Couch podcast, the podcast that gives you the view from the therapist chair. I'm your host, John Dennis, a licensed professional counselor. You're listening to OTC episode 26 with Dr. Jonathan Singer, president of the American Association of Suicidology. Welcome back, OTC listeners. It is a beautiful Wednesday in September, early September. So in OTC episode 25, you got to hear a conversation with Christy Peterson where we talked about school psychologists and what their role is specific to IEPs and 504s and risk assessments. And moving further into that topic of risk assessment, today I'm sharing a conversation that I had with Dr. Jonathan Singer, who he is the president of the American Association for Suicidology. And we're going to be talking a lot about youth suicide, which I know is a pretty heavy topic, but unfortunately it's just such a vital discussion to have. So we're coming off of September 8th through the 14th was the 46th annual National Suicide Prevention Week. So usually the second week in September there is National Suicide Prevention Week. And the entire month of September is known as National Suicide Prevention Month. But I definitely agree with the American Association of Suicidology when they say that, continuously spreading and advocating for research funding, suicide prevention awareness, it shouldn't be relegated to just 1 month or 1 week out of the year. This should be an ongoing pursuit. And so I would encourage you to use the American Association of Suicidology's hashtags AAS365 and hashtag #BeThere. Just to share some of the recent statistics, you'll hear Dr. Singer reference that the 2017 statistics from the CDC are the most recent data that they're working off of. But these stats come from the American Association of Suicidology. So if you just go to the suicidology.org, you can get to their facts and statistics page. But they say that suicide actually ranks as the 10th leading cause of death in the U.S., and it actually ranks as the second leading cause for ages 15 to 34-year-old. So total number of suicides in 2017 went up to 47,173. Broken down, that works out to one person every 11 minutes dying from suicide. In terms of fatal outcomes, so those individuals that did kill themselves by suicide, breakdown in terms of gender, 77.97% were male and 22.03% were female. In terms of age ranges for the fatal outcomes, 1.11% were children, that's age 5 to 14. 13.25% were in the 15 to 24-year-old range. 32.4% were 25 to 44 years of age. And then 35.07% were middle-aged from 45 to 64 years of age. And then 18.16% were 65 years or up. With regard to non-fatal suicide statistics, 1.2 million suicide attempts were recorded in 2017. So that's one attempt every 27 seconds, and 25 attempts for every death by suicide for the nation. Before I introduce Dr. Singer, I wanted to share a little bit of information for any of you that may be struggling yourselves with suicidal thoughts or actions, or if you have a loved one that is struggling with this topic. So the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is the 1-800-273-8255, or you can text HOME, that's HOME, to 741-741. The website is suicidepreventionlifeline.org, and they have a chat feature there. And then the Trevor Project, which is the leading national organization that provides crisis intervention and suicide prevention services to the LGBTQ youth. The number is 1-866-488-7386. So a lot of times, even when I'm with a client, if they have struggled with suicidal thoughts or actions, a lot of times when we're in session, I will call up one of those two numbers and be on the phone with them in the room and just kind of walk them through and sort of get them comfortable with, okay, if you need to call and you reach out, this is what you can expect. This is who you will speak with. These are the questions that they'll ask and the things that they'll look to talk with you about. And that way it sort of helps normalize it a little bit and gets them a little bit more comfortable, which I know when you're at the depths of some of those suicidal thoughts or feelings, it's one of the hardest things to do is to reach out for help. But I would encourage you just to reach out and familiarize yourself with it. That way, that could potentially make all the difference in the world when you are at those low points. Dr. Singer is, as I mentioned, the president for the American Association of Suicidology. He's also an associate professor of social work at Loyola University in Chicago. His clinical research interests focus on family-based interventions for suicidal and cyberbullied youth. In addition, he is the co-author of the 2015 Routledge text, Suicide in Schools, A Practitioner's Guide to Multi-Level Prevention, Assessment, Intervention, and Postvention. And he is also the founder and host of the award-winning podcast, The Social Work Podcast, found at socialworkpodcast.com. Well, I have here on the Couch podcast Dr. Jonathan Singer, and thank you so much for being willing to be on. I really appreciate you being on the show, and I've been looking forward to it. So, welcome.
Yeah, thank you. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here, John. I appreciate it.
Yeah, definitely. I try to keep things as light as possible until we really have to get serious. I often joke that I'm sort of like the Grim Reaper of trainings and things like that. I imagine you get that as well.
Wait, what do you mean the Grim Reaper of trainings?
I'm always talking about, human trafficking and suicide awareness and, a lot of the heavier stuff. I kind of joke, if I go to parties or get-togethers, I have to come up with this alter ego career because I'm like a mood killer.
Yeah, well, so my wife is a nurse midwife, and we would joke that, it wasn't a joke. Because of the society that we live in, people would ask me as the guy first, "What do you do?"
Uh-huh.
Right. There's that gendered assumption about employment. And so I'd be like, yeah, so I work with suicidal kids. And they'd be like, oh. And so then they turn to my wife. They're like, what do you do? She's like, I deliver babies. They're like, yay. But yeah, no. So when I don't want to be the downer or the Grim Reaper, I say, oh, I work with kids. And they're like, yay.
Yeah. Oh, that's so nice.
That's so great. How fulfilling.
Yes.
Yeah.
So for the listeners, what is your role? What do you do?
Yeah. So I'm currently the president of the American Association of Suicidology, which is the largest member organization of suicide prevention folks in the world. I am an associate professor of social work at Loyola University Chicago.
And for the listeners, he's got the hat representing.
That's right. I'm wearing the Loyola hat, and I'm the co-lead for the Social Work Grand Challenge Initiative, Harness Technology for Social Good.
Wow.
I'm the treasurer of the International Human Services and Internet Technologies Association. And, on the weekends, I'm dad to 3 kids.
Nice.
And so that's what I do.
That is quite a lot. Yeah. I always say, I just love having guests on that put me to shame, where I'm like, I leave feeling like I'm not doing anything with my life. Man.
Yeah.
So, okay. So through your work with, suicidology and the suicide awareness, I mean, obviously it's such a huge, important topic. I think we're always behind the times. I mean, everything's starting to catch on that, like, wow, mental health is important. Who knew? What are you seeing out there? Like, what are trends? I mean, statistics wise?
Yeah, sure. Well, so there's been a lot of buzz lately. Reports from the Centers for Disease Control about the increase in youth suicide rates. The 2017, which is the most recent year that we have data for at this moment, suggests that the youth suicide rate is the highest that it has been since 1981.
Wow.
And there are lots of questions about why that is. Why is it that it seems like kids are dying by suicide more than they have in the past? For folks who are parents, right? It's always important to think about, like, well, what is the context for these pieces of information, right?
Sure.
Because most of the time, parents and providers, we work with kids who are having thoughts of suicide or have made a suicide attempt. And sometimes we work with communities after a suicide death. So really, it's an interesting thing from a research perspective, because you have the news about death, but what people actually work with isn't death. It's kids who part of them wants to live and part of them wants to die. Or after a death, you work with a community, family members, loved ones that are grieving the loss of a loved one. So those are some of the stats around youth suicide.
Mm-hmm. And with that, I mean, you talked about the rise in that, and it seems like I know a lot of the older information and mindset was like, oh, well, males are more successful at committing suicide. Females are they attempt more often. And it seems like there is that, sadly, that the female population is catching up to the male.
Yeah.
And obviously also the LGBTQ community.
Sure. Yeah. So, I can dive into the stats a little bit more, but I want to point out something about language, really important for listeners to know. So as we have learned more from people who've lost loved ones to suicide, and as there have been more prominent voices of people who have survived suicide attempts, we've seen that some of the terms that we've used in the past are problematic. And so, like, the terms successful or failed are problematic terms when it comes to suicide. We don't want to say that somebody had a failed suicide attempt, but were successful at killing themselves, because it then posits the behaviors when somebody lives as a failure and when they die as a success. And so even though that's the language that's been used for 50 years, it's seen as problematic these days. The other one is that we don't use the term committed suicide anymore. People who have lost loved ones have been pretty vocal that there's this association with committing murder, committing rape, or even being committed to a psychiatric institution. And so the preferred term is dying by suicide. or killed themselves. So you could say this kid died by suicide or this kid killed himself. And what that does is it places the emphasis on the death as opposed to the method. And
Sure.
really, when someone dies, that's the thing that is the tragedy, right? That they're no longer there. Even when it's not a suicide death. I mean, I remember my grandfather, he had been, sick for years. And we we anticipated his death for probably like 15 years, but when he actually died, it was really sad.
Sure.
Right. And so this is for violent and unexpected or expected deaths. The focus is on the loss. Yeah.
And thank you so much for pointing that out and correcting the and I'm sure you've worked with this where a person, that terminology of failed, like, oh, I'm so, whatever, I can't even, kill myself. I screwed it up. I did it wrong.
Oh yeah, when people are like, "Yeah, I'm such a loser," or like, "I'm so like, I've screwed up so badly, like I can't even kill myself." Right? Absolutely. And that's something that people legitimately feel. There's a sense that they can't even overcome this propensity that we have for living. And I always reframe that as saying, even though you're scared and it seems like you're not able to do a lot of things that you want to do, there is part of you that is so strong that it is keeping you alive until you can figure out what that reason for living is. It might not be in your life yet. And this is actually one of the things that I've found most powerful from talking with attempt survivors is that sometimes they say, my reason for living wasn't in my life yet. There was a guy that I heard speak, and he said, my reason for living is my niece. But 15 years ago, she wasn't around. I didn't know that she was going to be my reason for living, but I stuck around long enough for that to happen.
Yeah, you're right. That's so powerful. The idea of you don't even know the possibility of that purpose.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I do want to get back to your question about stats because I do think it's important for people to know. So if you look at the rates of death per 100,000, they vary widely for kids, right? So you might see stats like 14 per 100,000. That means if there are 100,000 kids, 14 of them die by suicide. Mm-hmm. But if you look at the age group of 10 to 15, you're not going to see a 14 per 100,000, right? There's just not that many kids who die by suicide. But if you look more specifically at like Alaska Native kids or American Indian youth, you can see rates of 30 to 60 per 100,000. Wow. So as you start to move away from the generic and you move into specifics, suicide rates and rates of ideation and attempt vary widely. And this is an important thing for people to know, which is that in a certain community, and community can be a geographic community or a community of identity or culture, there can be very different rates or risk for suicide. So if you look at any newspaper article on suicide ideation, they typically reference the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, which is done every other year. There are a bunch of states that do it. And it says about 17% of high school students have at least one serious thought of killing themselves in the past year. That's a pretty concerning number. I mean, that's
sure,
1 in 5, 1 in 6. But if you break that out by sexual orientation and gender identity, actually, I should say sexual orientation because they don't have information on gender identity in the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. Sexual orientation, what you find is that heterosexual males have very low rates of suicide ideation. Gay and bisexual males have very high rates of suicide ideation. But if you are just thinking in terms of male, it averages out. So the rates and sort of the perceived risk for gay or bisexual boys seems lower than it actually is, but for straight boys, it seems higher than it actually is. And the same thing for girls. And so there can be a lot of value in saying, who is it that I'm trying to help if you're a provider? And what do we know about their actual rates? And again, this can vary by region also. So there's lots of ways to divide this up. And so if you're a parent, it's really important to support schools to say, I want you to be able to collect information about what the suicide risk is for our kids in this school. And so that means I want you to screen for suicide risk. I want you to ask questions in the last week. If you had thoughts of killing yourself in the last week, if you made a suicide attempt, I want you to keep those data so that we can have a sense of what's going on in our school, in our local community. And that can be really powerful.
Definitely. And for parents, if they were trying to access some of the numbers, where do you typically send them to look at?
So the numbers that are most sort of easy to access are
Facebook, right?
So Facebook, no, there's definitely a lot of information. I would go to the American Association of Suicidology or the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention.
Okay.
Those two places have stats. Now, a word of just like caution or just context for parents is you'll see stats and sometimes they'll say, 2015 or 2017. And we're used to things being like updated, like what was it yesterday?
Yeah.
But just know that those are sometimes the most recent stats available. And so the American Association of Suicidology and the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, suicidology.org and afsp.org, both of those places have the most recent stats.
Okay.
For the general public.
And as always, I kind of remind people, I'll throw those links into the show notes, so if they need to get to it, they can. In terms of risk factors, I know there is no one single answer. We would always like that, but obviously there are several. Can you sort of unpack that in terms of risk factors for teens?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the biggest risk factors is a sense of being disconnected from an important social group. And so, what if we think about what are the groups that are important for kids? Believe it or not, family is one of the most important groups for kids. The family is not going to influence what you're going to wear, your hair color, whether or not you have piercings. I mean, they can make rules about that, but that's really going to come from your peer group. But things about like how do I see the world? What are my values? What do I think is important? Like those things overwhelmingly come from the family. And so if kids feel like they are disconnected from parents, if they feel like they can't go to parents when they're feeling sad or lonely or scared, if they feel like their parents are harsh and critical all the time, if they feel like the family's not a safe place for them because of physical or sexual abuse or neglect, that can be a risk factor because they feel like they don't belong to the group that is in some ways the most important to them.
Sure. They're primary. That was there first, or should.
That's exactly right. And I always emphasize this with parents because many times parents think of adolescents as needing to disconnect from family and connect almost exclusively with peers. And that's not true. It's important for kids to be able to do both. So there's this idea of social isolation. There's And if you're in a school setting, right? I mean, you might have a great relationship with your parents, but if you're being ostracized or bullied, if you're being harassed at school, if the group of friends that you were really close with in elementary school suddenly reject you in middle school, that can add to risk. Now, that alone is unlikely to lead to somebody being suicidal. Typically, there is also some connection with some sort of mental illness. Now, I don't want to say that kids kill themselves because they have a mental illness, but oftentimes when you talk to kids, there is anxiety or depression or eating disorders, or in younger kids, ADHD or acting out oppositional defiant disorder or something like that. And those are the diagnoses. But what ends up happening is that when you're depressed, it's easy for you to think that nobody cares about you. And so even if you have a social group that's like, hey, why don't you come out with us? Hey, that was really good. In your brain starts playing tricks on you, and it says, well, wait a minute. They said that, but they probably don't mean it. And this just adds to what Tim Beck likes to call, the sort of the depressed triad, right? There's negative thoughts about self and others and the future. If you have symptoms of ADHD, and there's impulsivity or blurting out answers, or not staying on track with kind of social cues, that can lead to social isolation because peers say, well, we don't want you to be in our group. We don't want to do this project with you. It's hard for us. And so it's not because of the diagnosis, it's because of what happens socially as a result of it.
Sort of the ripple effects.
There's also a relationship with, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was saying sort of the ripple effects of.
Yeah.
That.
Exactly. And so in that sense, like for families, what I always say is, if there is any psychopathology, if there are mental health problems, have them checked out and addressed as early as possible in a kid's life. It will improve their social functioning. It'll improve their academic functioning, their sense of self-esteem, well-being, and all of these play into what we understand to be contributing factors for suicide risk. There's also some specific things so what we know is that kids who make more lethal attempts, oftentimes, especially for older adolescents, oftentimes there's substances involved. So a study by my colleague Kim O'Brien from several years ago, she looked at kids who were hospitalized for suicide attempts. And what she found was that the kids that made more lethal suicide attempts, and I'm not going to go into the details on this podcast for what a lethal suicide attempt is.
Thank you.
Just for safe messaging purposes. But the kids that made more lethal attempts also were the kids that were using substances, right? Or that were high or inebriated or under the influence during the suicide attempt. So there can be mental health problems kind of as a precursor or as a, kind of a foundational issue, but there can also be issues of impulsivity and sort of altered perception that can contribute in the moment to a more lethal suicide attempt. Okay.
And, kind of getting back to the some of the family stuff, definitely it sounded like you were talking about just high conflict families, just emotional, I guess, for lack of a better word, I keep thinking of regulation, but I know that's yes, but just the emotional climate in the family unit. Your feelings are valid and safe here, and we're able to hear that and talk about that as opposed to me trying to shut that down or invalidate that.
Yeah, because, if we think about little kids and the way that parents are there to love and support them and to take care of their needs, in adolescence, there's oftentimes this perception like the adolescent is ready to launch, like ready to go.
Mm-hmm.
I shouldn't be taking care of their needs for them, and developmentally for a lot of, there's a lot of truth to that, right? You shouldn't be clearing the dishes of a 13-year-old.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You shouldn't be picking out the clothes for a 13-year-old. There's some functional things that a 13-year-old should be able to do, but a 13-year-old isn't going to be able to work through the social issues that they're faced with
Mm-hmm.
in a way that an adult would. Questions about peer relationships, questions about feelings of rejection or loneliness or isolation. And that's when having the family, specifically the parents, be there to really kind of jump in like they did when their kid was little. Like, that's a really important thing to be able to do.
And yeah, man, with the whole social isolation piece, there's so many questions that popped up in my head of obviously the technology and the cell phone or the online gaming, some of that, the connection to the peer group and not feeling isolated, and so many parents that will clamp down on that or completely pull access to cell phone or things like that. Yeah, are you able to talk about the social isolation a little bit more?
Yeah. So this is an interesting thing because one of the things that happens is that parents see kids looking at their phones or their tablets, right? They sort of see them staring at a screen. And to the parent, it looks like the kid is isolating themselves from the family. Right? The parent's like, hey, it's time for dinner, and the kid doesn't respond. And so the parent's like, okay, this kid's off in their own world. The kid is not part of our social group. But it could very well be that kid is not socially isolating. The kid could actually be connecting in a very satisfying, pro-social, healthy way with people online. Now, obviously, it's possible that there's not healthy things that are going on online. But seeing a kid on a device doesn't mean that they are socially isolating. What it does mean is that when parents think, I don't know what my kid is doing online, it is a cue for them to figure it out. Now, this is a harder thing to do when you have a 17-year-old who's had their own device for 7 years, right? And they've just sort of been doing this thing. And to have a parent then be like, I need all your passwords and I need to mirror your phone to mine so I can see what you do all the time. Like, that's just, it's unrealistic. There's this phrase that I've seen float around the internet. I don't know who said it, but it goes something like, the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago, and the second best time is right now. And so if you can start early with kids to make kind of smartphone use or social media a family thing, that's better than not doing it. If they started out by themselves, the kids did, and it's a couple years later, it's still good to check in. Mm-hmm. No parent would say, I'm going to let my 11-year-old go to the mall by themselves for the first time. Right? They'd be like, I'm going to the mall with my kid.
Yep.
I will walk behind them, 50 feet so they can be with their friends. Like, I will monitor them. Like that, everybody would say, yes, that is good parenting. And in fact, way to go, because what you're doing is you're saying, yeah, I'm happy for you to go hang out with your friends in the mall, and you can wander through the stores and whatever, and I'm going to keep an eye on you. Mm-hmm. We need to do that with our kids online. And so that means early on having your kids' passwords. Mm-hmm. Like, that's a non-negotiable. Like, I have to have your passwords. I have to be able to access your phone whenever I need to. If I'm going to send you a friend request, you will accept it. If I find out you have a hidden, super secret, private now it's not so private or super secret anymore account, you lose your phone, right? Or you lose that account, and there's some consequences, right? So you do the thing that you know to do, but you've transferred it to an online world. Now, the reason why this is important is because in terms of suicide risk, there's been some pretty sensational headlines in the last couple of years about like our smartphones killing a generation and things like that. And the research doesn't support this idea that kids are killing themselves because of their smartphones. What the research supports is that for some kids who are already depressed or anxious and are already thinking about suicide, that being online and getting trolled or cyberbullied or socially isolated online can exacerbate those experiences that offline would contribute to increased suicide risk anyway. So there's a way in which their online experience mirrors what adults might think of as an offline experience. And so understanding why a kid would go online is a really important thing. If they're going online because they're queer and nobody in their school supports them, and in fact, the teachers make fun of them and encourages a culture of harassment and abuse, and they're going online to get validation, right? And to see YouTubers that are out and proud, and to be on forums where other kids are like, oh my God, I totally get that. That happened to me today. Here's what we did. And you're like, oh, thank you. Right. That is a very pro-social and life-affirming reason to be online. Mm-hmm. And so understanding what your kid is doing and why is really important in understanding whether or not being online may or may not contribute to suicide risk.
And the one thing I always share with parents is I remember there was a school psychologist in the Virginia area. He was primarily talking about human trafficking, but basically was saying, parents, pay attention to your kids, because if you don't, somebody else will. Mm-hmm. That idea that, and it may not be in the way that you want them to. And so, yeah, like you were saying, you wouldn't just take your, like right now we have a 2-year-old. I wouldn't take my 2-year-old and just throw him into the ocean. Like I would go with him. And
good job.
Yeah, thank you. But yeah, you would, slowly, expose them to that and help them navigate that and learn what's appropriate and what's not, and deal with, what comes with the internet, social media, and connecting with people and anything else. So,
mm-hmm. Well, and can I tag on to something that you just said that I think is really important? So, let's take your example, and instead of it being an ocean, let's say that you went to the pool with your 2-year-old. Have you taken your 2-year-old to a pool?
I have, and I have not thrown him into the pool.
Yeah. Okay. So,
I'm 2 for 2 here.
Good job.
Yeah.
So when you take your kid to the pool, even if you've never consciously thought about it, you have some rules for what is okay and what is not okay. Mm-hmm. And it's possible that within your family, the adults have different expectations for what's okay and what's not okay when the kid's in the pool. Mm-hmm. Right? And that's fine. That's actually helpful because kids grow up and they learn how to negotiate differences, and they understand that, there's a range of what's acceptable. Mm-hmm. If we think about, like, let's say there's a play date with you and a bunch of other parents and the kids in the pool, some of the parents would be like, I will not let my kid in the pool without, water wings or floaties, right? And then other parents are like, no way am I going to put floaties on my kid, because then they're not going to learn how to swim, right? So again, you have this range. What's really important for parents if we move out of the pool and into sort of an online world and we age kids, I know I'm asking your listeners to do a lot of cognitive jumping around right now, but so basically what I'm saying is that one of the things that families can do to decrease risk is to make sure that they're paying attention to their kids, that they can build community with other families who have shared values and shared rules about what's appropriate and what's not. And again, there can be a range of rules, right? I mean, like if you're at the pool and you see the kid with the water wings accidentally flip over and they're submerged, you're not going to be like, well, that's not my kid, and I never would have put my kid in water wings anyway. Like you're going to go and you're going to pick up the kid. Yeah. Right? So you want to have other parents, they're going to be like, well, even though that's not exactly how I would like my kid to be online, I'm still willing to jump in. Right? And so what you have then is you have a community of parents who are supporting each other with their adolescents and their pre-adolescents around issues that we know contribute to suicide risk. So, for example, one of the things with technology is this idea of online harassment. You know, when I was talking with Lisa D'Amour on my podcast about her book Under Pressure, one of the things that we talked about was this idea of adolescent boys harassing girls until they sent naked pictures. So if we think of that example and we think of girls feeling isolated, ostracized, harassed, bullied, unsafe, all these things that can contribute to suicide risk, one of the ways that we can address that isn't by focusing on the girls, it's by focusing on the boys. And to say, we need to have a community meeting of the parents of the boys who are all the same age, and we need to sit down, we need to say, it is never okay for you to ask a girl to send a naked picture of herself. Period. All of us are in agreement, and if any of us find out, there are serious consequences. End of discussion. Well, you probably wouldn't want to say end of discussion there because you don't want to say, does anybody want to talk about this? Yes. but like that's the idea. Like you can't have, and then if there's a parent that's like, well, I don't know. I mean, I don't see what's wrong with having, like, if a girl wants to send a picture, she can send a picture, right? Then you have a conversation. Everybody's on the same page. And so you're addressing an issue in a social context in a way that parents are good at addressing things, right? Or they should be good at it. They might not, but they should be able to think about that so that they can say, we are a community, and addressing suicide risk in any one kid is a community effort. And, you know, a sort of protective measure for your own kid if they're not the one struggling with it. Like you want to be a part of that discussion, that community, because just like we were saying, you know, you may not have the purpose in your life right now. Like your kid may not be dealing with it right then and there, but maybe down the road. Yes, that's exactly right. 100%. And what we found talking with kids who volunteer for crisis hotlines, like there's a youth line and teen line, is that these kids not only have learned, not only are they more confident about how to respond to peers who are struggling, but they themselves feel more comfortable reaching out when they are struggling, right? So being part of this community would likely increase somebody's comfort going to a peer or another adult and saying, hey, I'm having a hard time right now. Can we talk? And that's what you're looking for. You're listening to OTC episode 26 with Dr. Jonathan Singer, president of the American Association of Suicidology. We'll be right back after a brief word from our sponsor.
Life is hard. But Parenting and Family Solutions is here to help. Our board-certified counselors are easy to talk to and offer a safe, encouraging environment to help you with your unique needs. We specialize in helping clients of all ages deal with depression, anxiety, marriage issues, screen addiction, and ADHD, just to name a few. We now have daytime and evening appointments available in Harrisburg and Lancaster and accept most major insurance plans. Visit our website to learn more at www.parentfamilysolutions.com or give us a call at 717-602-5560. Let us help you build a stronger family and a healthier you.
Well, and that brings up, I'd wanted to ask if you can just touch on some of the myths that a lot of parents struggle with. I think the one we've already unpacked is the technology and access to that. But one of the ones I come into contact with the most is like, oh, well, they're just attention seeking. They just want attention.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So here's the thing. Like if somebody is saying, I'm going to kill myself, I like to do a little education with that kid. And I like to say, look, there's a difference between wanting to die and wanting to be happy. And if you're sad or you're scared or you're lonely or you're bored or you're angry, and what you want is to not be those things, right? Mm-hmm. You want to be happy or interested or, feeling safe or whatever. If you tell an adult, I want to kill myself, what they're going to do is they're going to focus on keeping you alive. Mm. And that might look like you're going to talk to a counselor, a social worker, you're going to talk to maybe a psychiatrist, you might end up going to the emergency department, you might end up being hospitalized, you might be recommended for medication. At no point does anybody really focus on you being happy. Mm-hmm. Because it's the adult's job to focus on keeping you alive. If, however, you are, let's say you're angry with your parents because they're not letting you do this, or you feel like it's unfair about that. If you say, I'm really angry with you, then the conversation can focus on, well, why are you angry and what can we do so that you're not angry? And that might still include going to see a counselor or a social worker. It might end up with some medication, but it probably isn't going to end up with a hospital. And you're probably not going to end up focusing on this issue of being alive or dead. And so there's a really big difference between wanting to be happy and wanting to die. If you do want to die, please let us know that. Please, because we want you to stay alive and we want to help you figure out your reasons for living. And so when I talk to parents, I think what parents need to know is that it's important to be able to have this conversation. Because sometimes kids say the only way that I can be happy, and I'm not saying that they actually think this through like this, but sort of their logic is the only way I can be happy is by letting people know how angry or upset I am. And the best way to do that is to say that I want to kill myself. And so what ends up happening is that parents say, okay, I know my kid isn't really suicidal. They're just saying this to get attention. And so the answer is yes, they are saying this to get attention. And so you should give them that attention.
Yeah, please pay attention.
Pay attention to them. But pay attention to them in this very specific way, which is let's talk about what it is you actually want. Not like I'm going to pay attention to you right now when you've said I'm going to kill myself. But actually, I'm going to pay attention to the more fundamental thing of what's not going well in your life that we can address. And again, sometimes it's not something that a parent can fix in the moment or that they can fix by themselves. That's when seeing a mental health professional is important. That's when having a community of other parents around can be really helpful, because you can be like, look, the thing that's making you so angry is me.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't you go talk to our neighbor? And they're like, great, I would love to go talk to our neighbor. So then they go talk to the neighbor, right? And then you have done what a parent needs to do, which is you have brokered safety and security for your kid. And that is valuable. You've also paid attention to them and acknowledged that what you need is something I can't give you right now. But you've done it in a way that maintains connection and it maintains their safety.
Well, and kind of going off of the like, I can't do that or fix that right now, but I will find a way. Like and the way is, through the neighbor or the counselor or things like that. But I'm hearing you and responding to that. And I think there you kind of, using the killed two birds with one stone sounds like a bad idea, but there
right,
it is.
Death metaphors are always tough when you're talking about suicide. Yep.
But the idea of, I usually explain to parents, like, either you have a kid who, they don't know how to express themselves, so that's their best way of doing it, or you have a kid who, yes, they actually want to die. And either one needs attention. And I think it hits on the other myth that I hear a lot of, like, well, if I talk about it, it's going to put the idea more in their head, which I would imagine you and I would both heavily disagree with, the idea
right.
that, no, it helps to normalize the emotional struggle or the life struggle and gives voice to that.
Yes. One of the we're living in this day and age where our elected officials are constantly spouting lies and saying that they're truth. And so we're living in an era where there's a question about, well, what is true? And so, if I were a parent and I heard some expert say, oh, you can talk to your kids about suicide and not put it in there, like not give them the idea, like I'd be like, really? That sounds like fake news. But here's the thing, it's not fake news. And the reason why we know it is because, first of all, you have mental health professionals who've been doing this for years. And in fact, when they talk to kids about suicide, they actually decrease their risk. So we know that from their clinical experience, but we also know it from research that when you ask kids survey questions about, have you had thoughts of killing yourself in the last year or last week or 2 weeks, those kids that answer yes actually report a decrease in their overall level of distress as a result of having been asked and answered that question. And so asking the question seems to reduce some of the things that can contribute to suicide risk, which includes increased distress, emotion dysregulation, things like that. And so there have been research studies with kids. There have been research studies with folks in the military, different groups that have all found the same thing, that asking the question about, have you had thoughts of killing yourself, doesn't increase suicide risk. I also think it's important for parents to know that there's a difference between thinking about the concept of suicide and thinking about killing yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So I can think about the concept of smoking crack, but it doesn't mean that I'm thinking about smoking crack.
Mm-hmm.
And so you, like, if you say, have kids thought about suicide, have high school kids thought about suicide, I would imagine almost all high school kids have thought about suicide as a concept,
mm-hmm.
right? Whether they've watched 13 Reasons Why or not. But if you change the question slightly, which is, do all high school kids have thoughts about killing themselves? Then the answer is no. And so that is a really big difference. So asking the question isn't going to make your kid suicidal. Does it mean that your kid is now thinking about the concept of suicide? Yes, but thinking about suicide is not the same as being suicidal.
And I know, so yeah, we've been talking about the community, creating that community, having the conversations, fostering those connections, monitoring, be aware of what your kid is doing online and things like that. In terms of trainings for parents, where do you typically point parents if they want more training and information?
Yeah, first of all, nice summary. Using your clinical skills.
Yeah, I have some training in it.
for the benefit of your listeners. Second of all, I would say that so mental health first aid is a training that provides parents with some really good foundational skills for understanding mental health issues, but also being able to have conversations that can be a little bit tricky. There's also a training called QPR, Question, Persuade, and Refer. And there's free online training, QPR training for the community. And again, it's just a way of learning some questions to ask and feeling more confident in being able to ask those questions and then know what to do when you get the answers. So those are two trainings that I would recommend that parents could participate in. If they have a kid who is currently in community mental health system, maybe seeing a therapist, maybe they're on medication, right? If that is sort of a larger part of their day-to-day life, I would recommend that they contact NAMI, the National Alliance for Mental Illness, because there are some family support groups that are oftentimes offered through local chapters that can be very helpful for family members of people who are more intensively involved in mental health services.
Okay. And the QPR and the mental health first aids, are you aware whether they're on the AAS or the AFSP website?
Yeah, so actually there's something called SPRC, the Suicide Prevention Resource Center, sprc.org, and that will have up-to-date information about programs and practices.
Okay.
And so I would say to go there. That's probably the best place to go for that.
And kind of, I guess I'm sort of working my way towards risk assessment and hospitalization and things like that. But if you're a parent, you have a child that's dealing with this, and you're looking for a therapist, in terms of treatment modalities, what should we be looking for? What works best?
As you know, it's not an easy question to answer because people come in with different issues. So, for example, if a kid comes in and they have been struggling with depression and they've been experiencing bullying in school and they have loving and supportive parents, and all of that seems to be good on the home front, right? But there are a lot of issues at school and some real kind of fundamental issues about the kid doing what we were talking about earlier about dismissing experiences that might be life-affirming and pro-social and saying, well, they're not real or it doesn't count. Like in that situation, I actually think there could be some benefit with some individual work with the kid and doing some family-based, kind of checking in and things like that. If, however, and so you could use cognitive behavioral therapy, you could use solution-focused therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, although real DBT is a pretty labor and time-intensive process. If there are any issues related to the family, like the kid doesn't feel like they can talk to their parents, or they wouldn't go to their parents when they're suicidal, or if the parents are somehow disconnected, they're like, yeah, we just learned there's been this bullying thing, and we checked in on it, and we're not really sure what's going on. Like, I would highly recommend a family therapy approach.
Okay.
Because kids are, well, you can't really do effective work with kids without working with their family, but the extent to which you're actually doing family therapy, in my mind, really depends on the extent to which there's family dysfunction.
Mm-hmm.
And so that for me would be kind of a deciding point.
Sure. And that, I think also why, in inpatient and acute crisis and stuff like that, treatment, the family piece is often a large part of it, so that you don't just return the kid to the same situation and nothing changes. So in terms of an evaluation to determine a teen, an adult, it seems like they're really struggling with some pretty significant stuff. They're not just thinking about it. What goes into that?
So suicide risk assessment. So the most important thing for a suicide risk assessment is understanding the story of what got the person from a place where they were wanting to live to a place where they were wanting to die. There's some specific questions that people ask, like, have you had thoughts about killing yourself? And sometimes you couch that in terms of like, like let's say that there's been a breakup recently, or they got expelled from school, or they have a court date coming up where they might be sent away, right? You can couch it and say things like, I know that sometimes when people have things going on in their lives, like an upcoming court date where they're afraid that they might be sent away to kiddie jail or detained or whatever, that even though they normally wouldn't have thoughts of ending their life, these things pop into their mind. And I'm wondering if that's ever happened to you, right? That's a way of using a technique that Sean Shea calls shame attenuation to uncover suicidal ideation without being blaming or shaming, right? And so, and if somebody's like, yes, then it can be helpful to find out, well, how frequently do you have them? How intense are they? How long do they last? What my co-authors and I did for our book, Suicide in Schools, is we added a question about location. Where do your suicidal thoughts happen? If you have a kid in school and the only place that they really have thoughts of suicide is at school, that gives you some really important information, like, well, what's going on at home that you don't have thoughts, and what's going on at school so that you do, or vice versa, right? So finding out the location. Do they have a plan? Have they thought about how they're going to do it? If their plan involves a certain method, do they have access to that method? Do they know how to use the method? Have they practiced, right? Have they looked for YouTube videos online? How much do they want to die, right? So I think the fundamental experience of being suicidal is ambivalence. And ambivalence means part of me wants something and part of me doesn't want something. And so part of me wants to live and part of me wants to die. And if you're talking about suicide risk with a kid and you're not acknowledging the part of them that wants to die, you're doing them a disservice, but you're also doing them a disservice by not exploring the part of them that wants to live. And so figuring out the extent to which they are suicidal, or how much of them wants to die. And with littler kids, the youngest kid I worked with that was legitimately suicidal was 4.
Wow.
She had a plan and she knew what, I was like, what's going to happen after you kill yourself? And she's like, nothing. I will be gone and dead and I'll be never coming back. Right.
Wow.
And so that was pretty clear that she knew what she was doing. Now, I've talked to 10-year-olds who are like, well, after I kill myself, then the next weekend I'm going to go to the Lego store. And you're like, okay, I understand what's going on here. And what I understand is that they don't understand what it means to kill themselves. And so that's an important piece of information. But so knowing about how much somebody wants to die is a really important thing, and have they thought it through? The other thing that's really important when we think about assessment is focusing on the reasons for living, right? What are the strengths? What are the things that you do when you're feeling upset or distressed that make you feel less distressed? What are the things that you actually are looking forward to? And as we mentioned earlier, sometimes people can't think about like a big amazing thing that's like this is going to be the one thing. So they might be like, well, I heard that Taylor Swift has a new song coming out. Or like, okay, that's great. Like, that's a reason for living,
Sure.
I mean, maybe not for everybody, but if that's what the kid, yeah, if that's what the kid comes up with, that's awesome. Or, they're like, I heard there's an Easter egg in the new Marvel movie and I'd love to see that. It's like, great. That's so good. Like, let's focus on that. And building these up little piece by little piece is really important. And I will say one other thing. This kind of brings up the point that I always remind parents with, which is, I remind them that things that are big deals for kids are oftentimes not big deals for adults, right? And obviously things that are big deal for adults, oftentimes kids are like, why is that a big deal?
Yeah.
So if a kid is saying, I'm suicidal because you won't let me see the movie. Mm-hmm. Don't dismiss that as being just this unimportant thing. For whatever reason, it could be that seeing that movie is for them a huge deal, right? It could be as huge as somebody in their mid-20s saying, I don't think we should be in a relationship because you don't want me to meet your parents. Mm-hmm. Or somebody in their 40s saying, I don't think that there's a future for me at this firm because they have not considered me for a promotion in the last 10 years, mm-hmm. right? Like, but somebody's like, well, but you have a job, don't you? And you like it. You get paid enough, right? So like, what's the big deal, right? So people coming in from the outside and judging what is distressing is not helpful. And so parents,
thank you.
they do better by validating the kid's experience rather than judging it and dismissing it.
Mm-hmm. Well, and a lot of times I equate that to, I always reference the badly dubbed Kung Fu movie where, the person on screen is clearly saying a lot more than the subtitle is saying. And yeah, that idea that the kid, the best they can come up with right then is, I want to kill myself. Mm-hmm. But there's a lot more subtext that's not getting looked at.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, and if you ever think about yourself as an adult, like in the middle of a heated argument, you're not coming up with the most nuanced, clever things to say.
Yeah.
And in retrospect, you're like, oh my God, I'm mortified that I actually said that. Or like when you're talking with your kid and you're like, wow, I sound exactly like my dad.
Yep.
How did that happen? And it's because we're not particularly creative. And so a kid who is in a suicidal crisis is similarly not going to be the most eloquent person. So mm-hmm. I like that. And
yeah, with I guess we can kind of get into some of the myths and some of what to prepare for. If you have determined like, okay, I think my teen needs emergency services. I think we need to get him evaluated. What do you tell them to prepare for that? And then we can kind of get into some of the myths, I guess, off of that.
Well, so I think that like if let's say a school calls and says, hey, your kid has made a suicidal statement, we talk to them and it does seem like they've been thinking about suicide, and we'd really like for you to take them to the community mental health center or the emergency department for an assessment. Like in that case, what you're talking about is your kid is going to go through a suicide risk assessment. Hopefully people will be asking you as a parent questions and trying to get a sense of what's going on. If the person doing the assessment, and it's always a team thing, right? So people are always staffing with supervisors and stuff like that because it's such a important thing to get right.
Sure.
If the people who are involved in the assessment don't think that the kid can be kept safe at home, then that's going to increase the likelihood that they'll recommend hospitalization or some sort of more restrictive environment. Now, you could have a kid who's at what I think of as kind of moderate to high risk for suicide, meaning that they have thoughts about killing themselves. They've got plans. They have access to the means. They have some reasons for living, but not a lot. And they could be sent home if they have a strong support network that is resourceful, can maintain a safe environment for the kid at home, both physically and emotionally. But you could have a kid that's lower risk that is recommended for hospitalization because there isn't that same sort of safety and support at home. And so these are really important considerations for the providers, but also for the parents to know that what happens at home actually influences decisions about whether or not to hospitalize.
Okay, sure. And yeah, I guess getting into some of the myths of, I'm sure you hear a lot of kind of off the wall things of, we've been through this umpteen times. What's the point? We go there, we sit there, they ask us questions, and then they send us home. So why bother?
Right. And so one of the things about that is that, first of all, if you've done this umpteen times, you know that you should probably bring like a bottle of water, some snacks, your phone charger, right? Because you can be there in the emergency department for a while.
It is not like checking into the Ritz-Carlton. No.
No, definitely not. And suicide risk assessment is not something that can be done on a schedule. Right? You don't want somebody, it's not like Jiffy Lube, where you drive in and you're like, that was awesome. I got done in 15 minutes and then I can get on my way. Right.
You're in for a bit of a wait. Yeah.
You're in for a bit of a wait because, at Jiffy Lube, if they don't actually let all of the old oil drain out, then it's not the end of the world.
Yes.
But if your kid is suicidal, like you actually want to spend the time to figure out what is going on. Mm-hmm. And so if it just so happens that there are 3 other kids in the emergency department that day, they're not going to call in 3 times as many people, right? You're going to have the people who are staffing it there. That's it. And so you're going to have to wait. Mm-hmm. And then sometimes what happens is that if a kid waits in an emergency department for 5 hours,
they're not.
and they're tired and they're hungry and their suicidal crisis has passed, then they will be talking with somebody and the person's like, well, it sounds like this was going on and it's not going on anymore. And parents, you sound like you can manage the kid at home, so we're going to send you guys home. Well, it doesn't mean that time was wasted. It actually means that you got done what you came to do, which is to assess the risk. Mm-hmm. And at that moment, the risk was not high enough to warrant putting your kid in the most restrictive environment.
Well, and off of that, so many misconceptions of definitely, decades ago, sort of mental health institutions and like, so they're going to assess them and they're going to be put in like a straitjacket and a padded room and they're going to like throw away the key or keep them for, a year or things like that. Obviously, it is not that way.
No, it's not. And I don't know if there was like a sort of a further point that you were going to make with that, but what I will say that's really important for parents to think about is that kids are admitted typically for like 48 to 72 hours. Mm-hmm. If you have a really generous insurance policy and there happen to be nobody else, like they don't need the beds, maybe you could be there for 5 days. But that that institutionalization is not going to address the things that made your kid suicidal.
Mm-hmm.
And so the days of getting hospitalized for 3 to 6 months have been over for 30 years, right? It's just not something that happens. And so if people think, I'm finally at the hospital, they're finally going to be able to fix it, that's not true.
Well, and thank you so much. Yeah, I guess the point that I was trying to make is, yes, it is not that way. This is what it is now. And I like the way that you put that, but just the idea of, their life is happening outside of that hospital unit. And therefore the factors that are contributing to how they're feeling and that suicidality are outside the hospital. The hospital is to help them stabilize and keep them alive. Mm-hmm. Then go back.
Yep. That's right. And sometimes, it can be really hard in the community to get access to a child psychiatrist, right? So if there might be questions about medication, interactions, hospitalization actually ends up being one of the times when hospitalization is most useful, because there's always a psychiatrist that can come and do a med check and maybe make a recommendation about dosage or make a recommendation about switching meds. And so that can be really helpful. It can also be problematic if they make a recommendation that is wildly different than what has been happening in the past.
And again, like I said, there's so many different rabbit holes we could go down of, we went there and they took my kid off of all of his meds, and like, I don't even know what they're doing. It just seems like they're just trying stuff at random. And usually I try to help parents understand, a lot of times you have to go back to, step one to kind of figure out, okay, where are things coming off the rails? What's going on?
Yeah, that's true.
And I guess to kind of bring it home here, if you were talking to every parent on the planet right now, what would you want them to understand about teen suicide?
Well, the first thing is that parents are the most important people in a kid's life. And that there is, not only is there nothing wrong with asking kids about suicide and suicidal thoughts, but it's actually the best thing to do if you think that your kid might have thoughts of suicide. So I want parents to know to ask the questions. Hey, I'm wondering if you've, been feeling sad or hopeless lately. I'm wondering if you've had thoughts about, maybe this world isn't for me. If you've ever wondered if you'd be better off dead. I'm wondering if you've ever thought about ending your life. Have you ever thought about ways to kill yourself, right? What I just did there is I went through kind of a progression from kind of broader like hopelessness and sadness to death to killing yourself, right? And so you can lead up to those questions, and being a parent who's able to ask those questions, it can be terrifying and empowering, because you're like, wow, I had that conversation. And then, at some point down the road, you'll be like, well, that was a tough time. I had to have a conversation that, when I was first snuggling this little baby, it never dawned on me that I would ever have to wonder if they wanted out. But I did. And I asked the questions, and I was there for them, and we're stronger and better as a result. Right. I also want parents to know that, attachment-based family therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, these are all mental health treatments that have been shown to reduce suicide ideation and suicide attempts for some kids. And so if you do have to seek mental health treatment, and suicide risk seems to be like one of the central issues, you can find treatments that have been shown to work, right? And so those are out there. The other thing that I would want parents to know is that just like we never expect a mental health provider to do a suicide risk assessment and to manage suicide risk by themselves, we also don't expect parents to be able to do this by themselves. And so going back to what I was talking about before about like having a community of support, that is so important. And if it means that your community of support meets on a Facebook Messenger group, that's fine. Right? There's no judgment about that, right? If you've got a GroupMe or a WhatsApp group or whatever, like connect with the parents and make sure that you have parents that can be supportive. And when your kid's suicidal crisis is over, you're going to want to take a break, and I understand that, but don't step away from the group forever, because there might be another parent that really needs you in a year, because what parents want is they actually want to connect with the parents who have been through it and come out on the other side, more so than they want the professional who can just talk to them.
Sure. Yeah. Man, that's so important. Oh. Thank you so much. So what projects are you working on? I don't know if you can share anything that's coming up in the next year. It sounds like you're a pretty busy guy.
Well, I'm planning the American Association of Suicidology conference in Portland in April of 2020. And so that's going to be an amazing conference. If you have, for the listeners that are in the Portland area, the Pacific Northwest, please come to the conference. It's going to be an amazing combination of researchers and clinicians and people who have survived suicide attempts and parents who've lost loved ones to suicide.
I was going to say, so is that open to general public, or that's more for clinicians, or is everybody? Yeah,
it's open to the general public. Anybody that has an interest in this topic. It's a great conference. Now it's a conference for everybody. So, there are going to be some sessions that might sound way more researchy than you're interested in, but that's fine. You don't go to them. I'm also, the second edition of my book, Suicide in Schools, is going to be out next year. And, if you're a parent, of course, you're welcome to pick it up and read it. But what I've found is that parents who have an interest in this will buy a copy and give it to their school counselor, or they will recommend it to the superintendent as a resource for the mental health professionals in their school district. And it's more effective for parents of kids in schools to say, hey, we found this book helpful and we'd like staff to read it, rather than me as the author going and saying, hey, I think you should buy my book.
Sure.
So those are a couple things that are going on.
Okay. And if people have questions, if they want to get in touch with you, are they able to do that? How are they able to do that?
Yeah. So, you can just Google Jonathan Singer, and if you put the word suicide in, then you'll definitely reach me. If you just Google Jonathan Singer, you might come up with, there's a state representative from Colorado named Jonathan Singer, who is also a social worker.
Oh, wow.
So if you type in Jonathan Singer social worker, you might see this bald guy with a red beard.
That is not you.
And that's not me. So, yeah.
So don't send that guy your questions.
Yeah, he'll just forward it to me because we know each other, because people have confused us online. So.
Oh, okay, nice. You have a connection of singers.
That's right.
All right. Well, again, thank you so much just for everything that you are doing to get this information out there to families, clinicians. I mean, obviously, I think it's one of the most important things as humans that we can focus on. So, thank you.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for having me on and giving me the opportunity to speak to the folks listening. I really appreciate it.
Take care.
All right. Talk to you later.
So that about wraps up episode 26. Again, a huge thank you to Dr. Singer for being generous with his time and being willing to be on the show. Just to recap, so if you or a loved one is struggling with suicide and needs resources or needs to speak with somebody, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline number is 1-800-273-TALK. That's TALK. You can also text HOME, HOME, to 741-741. Or if you go to suicidepreventionlifeline.org, there's a chat feature there. And then the Trevor Project, which focuses on providing crisis intervention and suicide prevention services to LGBTQ youth, is 1-866-488-7386. Thanks for stopping by and listening to the show. In OTC episode 27, I'll be talking with some of the staff from United Disability Services Foundation about their service dog programs. If you liked what you heard, be sure to subscribe and review wherever you're catching this podcast at. You can check out detailed show notes and archived episodes at www.pfsonthecouch.com. If you want to stay up to date on future guests and contribute questions, be sure to follow us on your favorite social media platforms. The author and host of this podcast is not engaged in a therapeutic relationship with the listener and cannot give counseling advice without a confidential appointment. Listeners should be sure to consult with a licensed therapist in their area or seek emergency medical attention if they are experiencing psychological difficulty. A special thanks to the band The Topsy-Turvies for the show theme song. Their song, Like a Living Dead, can be found at topsyturvies.bandcamp.com. The bump interview track was the song 1973 by Bruno E. The author and host of this podcast is John Dennis. Special thanks to editor and show producer Trevor Groff.